I never imagined that reaching 75 would mean sitting in a hospital room, staring at the door as if my whole life depended on it. I never thought I would wait for my own child the way people wait for rescue. That night, lying on the hard hospital bed with an IV needle in my arm, I listened to carts rattling in the hallway and tried to steady my breath. My thoughts circled around one thing. My daughter promised she would come back in the morning, and I held on to that promise as if it were the only thing keeping me awake. Morning came. She didn't. And nothing in this world cuts as sharply as the silence of a phone that never rings. I lay there, watching sunlight move across the wall, realizing how much hope I had wrapped around a person who had long ago stopped wrapping anything around me. I kept trying to convince myself she must have had a reason, that she was probably busy, that maybe she didn't hear her phone. But deep inside I knew it wasn't about circumstances, it was about priorities. The nurses moved through the ward with a calm rhythm, chatting softly with patients, adjusting pillows, checking monitors. Their attention felt warm, grounding. I caught myself feeling grateful for simple human presence. The kind that doesn't need to be asked for. The kind that doesn't come with excuses. As the hours passed, the truth settled deeper. I wasn't waiting for my daughter. I was waiting for the version of her that no longer existed. The one who used to run to me with scraped knees, who called me for advice, who once said she wanted to grow up to be strong like me. Somewhere along the way, that girl faded, and the woman who replaced her had built a life where I didn't fit. Lying there, I felt a slow, painful shift inside, the kind that happens when denial finally gives way to clarity. My body was weak, but my understanding became painfully sharp. I began to realize that this hospital bed wasn't the lowest point of my life. It was the moment I stopped pretending. I stopped making excuses for someone who no longer saw me as a priority. I stopped believing that age meant I had to accept neglect quietly. And for the first time, instead of asking why she didn't come, I found myself asking why I'd waited at all. The day moved forward, and with every hour I felt something inside me rearrange. Slowly, carefully, like a fragile structure finally finding its true balance. By evening, I wasn't hoping anymore. I was observing. I was thinking. I was remembering that I still had choices to make, and that the story of my life didn't end in this room, waiting for someone who chose not to walk through the door. And maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something I had been too afraid to claim for decades. A life where I no longer apologized for wanting to be valued. The second day in the hospital felt strangely different. My body was still weak, but my mind had stopped waiting for footsteps in the hallway. I no longer watched the door. I no longer lifted my head every time a shadow moved. Something inside had settled, not healed, but settled, in the quiet way a wound accepts, the truth that it won't be tended by the person it was meant for. As morning light filled the room, I noticed how peaceful the ward looked. Patients shuffled slowly to the bathroom, nurses exchanged charts, and carts rolled by with the soft clatter of plastic wheels. Life continued steady and indifferent, and for the first time, I didn't feel pierced by the idea that I wasn't part of anyone's urgent concern. There was a kind of clarity in accepting reality without fighting it. It didn't make the disappointment smaller, but it made it cleaner. I thought about my daughter, not the one who never arrived yesterday, but the child she used to be, the one who drew pictures for me in school, who fell asleep leaning on my shoulder during long bus rides. It hurt to admit that the person she had become no longer carried that child inside her. But pretending otherwise had hurt me even more. As the afternoon came, the hospital social worker visited my room. She reviewed my chart, asked about medications, and gently asked about my home life, whether I had support, whether someone could help me after discharge. Her questions weren't intrusive. They were practical, but each one felt like a quiet spotlight shining on a part of my life I preferred to keep dim. I answered honestly, realizing as I spoke that I had very little help to rely on. Not because help didn't exist in the world, but because I had spent years depending only on one person, hoping she would eventually understand how much I needed her. It wasn't fair to either of us, and it wasn't sustainable anymore. By evening, I felt exhausted, not physically, but emotionally, the way you feel after finally facing a truth you've been avoiding. But along with the exhaustion came something else. A soft, steady determination. I realized I needed to rethink not only my expectations, but also my boundaries. I needed to separate love from dependency. I needed to stop believing that motherhood guaranteed reciprocity. It was painful to admit that my daughter's choices had made me feel like a guest in her life. But it was even more painful to see how willingly I had accepted that role. Night fell quietly. The lights in the hallway dimmed. The ward settled into its familiar symphony of distant beeps and soft footsteps. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, knowing something inside me had shifted permanently. I wasn't simply recovering from an illness. I was recovering from years of emotional erosion, and with every breath I understood more clearly that I would leave this hospital with a different heart, one that no longer chased after people who walked away, and one that no longer measured its worth by who showed up. The third day began with a kind of quiet resolve I hadn't felt in years. My body was still fragile, but my thoughts were no longer scattered. It was as if pieces of my life, long ignored or misplaced, were slowly falling back into place. Not perfectly, not comfortably, but honestly. The nurses brought breakfast, adjusted the blinds, and moved on with their morning routine. I watched them work with an ease born from repetition, and I found myself admiring their steadiness. Their care wasn't emotional, it was consistent. And sometimes consistency heals more than affection ever could. I spent most of the morning thinking about the last few years, not the dramatic moments, but the small ones that added up over time. The missed birthdays, the postponed visits, the explanations that sounded more like excuses, the subtle shift in tone each time my daughter spoke to me, as if motherhood had become a weight she no longer wanted to carry. For a long time, I blamed myself for that shift. I told myself I hadn't done enough, or I had done too much, or I had been too protective, or not protective enough. Mothers can invent endless ways to take responsibility for the failings of others. But lying in that hospital bed, I saw it differently. My daughter had grown into someone who simply didn't need me anymore. At least, not in a way that went beyond convenience. And I had refused to see it, because accepting it meant letting go of the last piece of my own identity. In the afternoon, the volunteer stopped by again. She brought a small blanket and placed it at the foot of my bed, explaining that some patients felt warmer with something soft near their legs. It was such a simple gesture, but it touched me in a place I didn't know was still reachable. Strangers had offered more comfort in 3 days than my own child had in years. And instead of feeling bitterness, I felt clarity. Kindness is not a duty. It is a choice, and some people choose not to offer it. Later, a young doctor visited. He reviewed my chart, asked about my appetite, adjusted the medication schedule. He also asked whether someone would stay with me after discharge, whether I had help getting groceries, whether someone could drive me to follow-up appointments. His questions were practical but revealing. They showed me a version of my life I had refused to acknowledge, a life lived largely alone, not because I wanted solitude, but because I had been left in it. As evening crept in, I watched the light fade through the thin hospital curtain and realized something else. My healing wasn't just physical. My mind was finally stepping out of a shadow it had lived in for too long. I understood that I didn't need to push anyone out of my life, but I needed to stop pulling them in. I needed to stop clinging to a relationship defined by absence. I needed to allow myself to expect less from others and more from myself. That night, I fell asleep without checking my phone even once, not because I believed my daughter might call, and not because I had stopped loving her, but because I finally accepted that love doesn't always travel in both directions, and I could live with that truth, as long as I stopped letting it define me. The 4th day in the hospital arrived with a kind of calm that felt almost unfamiliar. It wasn't peace in the usual sense. It was a quiet acceptance that came after days of finally allowing myself to feel everything I had avoided for years. The monitors hummed softly, nurses moved gently through the halls, and sunlight crept across the floor in thin, pale strips. I watched the room fill with morning light and realized that something inside me had settled in a way I hadn't expected. A volunteer came by with a small radio, an old-fashioned one with a dial that clicked faintly as she adjusted it. She said many older patients found comfort in the low, constant sound of a human voice in the background. When she left the room, the soft static and distant music created a new kind of atmosphere, not lively, but warm in a quiet, steady way. It filled the gap that had opened inside me when I understood my daughter wasn't coming back, at least not in the way I had hoped. A doctor visited shortly after. He wasn't there long, but he asked questions that touched something deeper than my medical chart. He wanted to know if someone was waiting for me at home, if I had support, if someone could help with groceries or medications once I was discharged. The questions were routine for him, but for me they highlighted the parts of my life I had tried not to examine too closely. I realized, with a heavy but honest clarity, that I had no real support to rely on. I wasn't surprised, but admitting it felt like standing in front of a mirror for the first time in years and finally seeing the truth without trying to soften it. In the afternoon, a new patient was brought into the room, a woman around my age with tired eyes and a gentle presence. We didn't speak much, but there was a quiet understanding between us, a shared recognition of living through more than we ever expected to endure. At one point, without turning her head, she said something that settled deep within me. That loneliness doesn't come from being without children, but from having children who have chosen not to be part of your life. The words weren't meant as comfort or criticism. They were simply truth, spoken by someone who had learned it the same way I had. The evening passed in a rhythm of small observations. Nurses checking vitals, dinner trays arriving, lights dimming in the hallway. Every interaction felt softer, perhaps because I had finally stopped bracing myself for something that wasn't going to happen. The strain of waiting had worn me thin, but letting go gave me a strange, unexpected strength. As night settled in, I thought of all the years I had spent shaping my life around the hope that my daughter would show up for me the way I had always shown up for her. I had believed that love guaranteed reciprocity, that motherhood ensured loyalty, that raising a child meant never being forgotten in old age. The hospital stay had stripped away those assumptions one by one, leaving me with a different, more realistic understanding of what I could count on. I began to see that my life needed to change in ways I had avoided for far too long. Not dramatically, not out of anger, but through quiet, steady steps. I needed to put protections in place, emotional, practical, even legal, so no one could make decisions for me simply because I was older and alone. I remembered a neighbor who had recently taken similar measures, seeking legal advice to safeguard her home and her autonomy. For the first time, I understood why she had done it. And for the first time, I knew I had to do the same. That realization didn't come with bitterness. It came with a rare kind of relief, a feeling that I had finally reached a point where I could decide how I wanted the rest of my life to unfold. A life no longer shaped by waiting for someone else to choose me. That night, I fell asleep not from exhaustion, but from acceptance. There was no weight in my chest, no constant checking of the door, no silent hope that someone might still arrive. There was only the soft hum of the radio and the steady, quiet strength of a woman who had finally stopped looking outward for something that needed to come from within. For the first time in a long time, I slept knowing that once I left the hospital, I wouldn't be returning to the same version of myself. The morning of my discharge arrived with a sense of calm I could feel down to my bones. It wasn't the kind of calm that comes from having everything figured out, but the kind that appears when a person finally stops fighting their own truth. The nurse removed the last of the IV tape from my arm, gave me a list of medications, and wished me well. Her smile was warm, steady, the kind that doesn't ask for anything in return. I realized I had grown more accustomed to the kindness of strangers than to the presence of the person I once counted on most. I walked slowly down the hallway, leaning lightly on the railing, noticing details I hadn't seen before: the faded posters on the wall, the soft hum of the vending machine, the bouquet of flowers wilting at the nurse's station. It struck me how many lives intersect in a place like this. How many unspoken stories unfold behind closed curtains. Mine was just one of them, but for the first time it didn't feel small. It felt real. Outside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of rain. The hospital courtyard glistened under the thin spring sunlight. I stood at the entrance for a long moment, letting the breeze brush over my face. No one was waiting for me, but the absence didn't sting the way it once did. I wasn't stepping into loneliness. I was stepping into autonomy. The taxi ride home felt like moving between chapters, the kind of transition where the heart is both tender and steady. When the car pulled up in front of my house, I paused before getting out. The porch looked exactly as I had left it. The windows reflected the same familiar light, yet everything felt different because I was different. Inside the house, the silence greeted me like an old companion. Not heavy, not accusing, simply present. I placed my bag on the table and walked from room to room, touching the back of a chair, smoothing a wrinkle in the curtain, opening a window to let fresh air in. Each small action grounded me a little more. This was my space, untouched and waiting. Not for someone else's arrival, but for my return. I made a cup of tea, something simple and warm, and sat at the kitchen table. I looked around and saw the subtle signs of a life that had been put on hold: the stack of unopened mail, the half-wilted plant by the sink, the blanket draped over the arm of the chair. These were things I could tend to, one by one. There was comfort in that. Later that afternoon, my phone buzzed. My daughter's name lit up the screen, but I didn't answer immediately. I let it ring, and with each passing second, I realized how much I had allowed her choices to shape my emotional landscape. I had given her the power to define not only how loved I felt, but how valuable I believed I was. That power no longer belonged to her. When the call finally went to voicemail, I placed the phone face down on the table. I would call back when I was ready, not when I was desperate. For the first time in years, I felt no pressure to justify my silence. In the days that followed, I took small but meaningful steps toward restructuring my life. I met with the lawyer my neighbor had recommended. She was compassionate and direct, guiding me through the process of legally safeguarding my home, my finances, and my independence. It felt strange to speak so clearly about what I wanted. Strange, but liberating. I wasn't protecting myself from my daughter out of anger, but out of responsibility to the woman I was becoming. I began attending a support group at the local senior center. The room was filled with women who carried their own stories of disappointment, abandonment, and quiet resilience. We sat around a table drinking weak coffee from styrofoam cups, sharing experiences in low, measured voices. There was no judgment, no pity, just a shared understanding of how complicated love can be as we grow older. Being among them felt like uncovering a part of myself I had forgotten existed. Little by little, I found solace in routines: watering my plants, folding laundry, listening to the radio the volunteer had left on my hospital nightstand. These small moments, once overshadowed by waiting, now felt like choices. Gentle affirmations that I was rebuilding my life with intention rather than habit. One evening, as I sat on the porch wrapped in a shawl, the phone rang again. My daughter's name appeared, and this time I felt no rush of anxiety or hope. I answered calmly, ready to speak without shrinking. She asked how I was doing, her voice uncertain. I listened, responding simply, without explaining my silence or justifying her absence. For the first time, the conversation didn't feel like a plea for connection. It felt like a boundary, firm, steady, necessary. When I hung up, I didn't feel sorrow. I felt clarity. As the sun dipped behind the rooftops and the first cool notes of evening settled in the air, I understood something profound. My life was not defined by who showed up for me, but by how I chose to show up for myself. The years ahead would not be shaped by fear of abandonment, but by a renewed belief in my own worth. I sat there for a long time, listening to the quiet of my own home, and felt a sense of peace settle over me. Not because my daughter had changed, but because I had. I wasn't waiting anymore. I was living, and somewhere inside I knew the strongest chapter of my life was just beginning.